I never imagined that silence could scream louder than any words they ever spoke to me. It wasn't the dramatic, echoing silence of an empty concert hall, but the thick, suffocating quiet of a home filled with people who had forgotten I existed in any meaningful way. It was the silence that settled in the space between their brief, distracted hellos and their hurried goodbyes. It was the silence of my phone on a Tuesday afternoon, a day they used to call. It was the silence of my own voice, which had long ago learned not to ask for too much, not to expect anything at all. This particular morning, the silence was a physical presence in my kitchen. Sunlight, thin and pale as watered-down milk, streamed through the window over the sink, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. It cast a gentle, almost mocking, glow on my hands, submerged in warm, soapy water. My knuckles were swollen, the joints stiff with the arthritis that had become my constant companion. These hands had once been strong and capable, hands that could soothe a fevered brow, bake a perfect apple pie, and clap with unrestrained joy at every one of my children's small triumphs. Now, they were just old, the skin a road map of wrinkled parchment, the nails brittle. They moved with a mechanical, practiced rhythm, washing the breakfast dishes, my single plate, my single fork, my single glass. The house around me was still, but not empty. Upstairs, I could hear the faint, muffled sounds of my son, Mark, on a work call. His voice was a low, confident murmur, the sound of a man in charge of his world. He had moved back in 6 months ago, after his divorce. "Just for a little while, Mom," he'd said, his eyes avoiding mine. "Just until I get back on my feet." I had welcomed him, of course. This was his home. I had cleared out his old room, put fresh sheets on the bed, and stocked the refrigerator with his favorite foods. But a little while had stretched on, and he had settled into a routine that barely included me. He was a ghost in his own childhood home, a passing shadow in the hallway, a closed door at the end of the hall. My daughter, Linda, didn't live here, but her presence, or lack thereof, was just as loud. She lived 20 minutes away, in a sprawling suburban house with her husband and my 2 grandchildren. In the early days, she'd bring the kids over every Sunday. The house would erupt with the chaotic, beautiful noise of life. But the visits had grown shorter, then less frequent. Now, they were relegated to major holidays and birthdays, obligatory appearances that felt more like a chore than a joy. My eyes drifted to the collection of photographs on the wall next to the refrigerator. A gallery of ghosts from a happier time. There was Mark, age 7, grinning with a missing front tooth, holding up a string of fish. There was Linda, age 10, in a pink tutu, her face a mask of serious concentration at her first ballet recital. There was a family portrait from a vacation to the Grand Canyon 20 years ago, all of us tanned and smiling, my husband, Robert, with his arm wrapped tightly around my shoulders. Robert had been gone for 5 years now, and with him, it seemed, had gone the glue that held us all together. I was the center of that photograph, the sun around which my little family had orbited. Now, I felt like a distant, forgotten planet, cold and light years away. I placed the last dish in the drying rack with a soft, final clink. The sound was unnervingly loud in the quiet kitchen. As I turned to dry my hands, my gaze fell upon a piece of paper on the counter, held down by a salt shaker. It was a note from Mark. Not a letter, not even a real note. Just a few words scrawled on a torn piece of illegal pad in his sharp, impatient handwriting. "Mom, out of town for a conference Wednesday to Friday. Left some laundry in the hamper. Could you? THX. That was it. No I love you. No have a good week. Not even a see you Sunday. Just a request, an assumption. Could you?" It wasn't a question. It was a command disguised as one. He wouldn't be visiting me this week because he was already here, and yet he was still absent. The laundry was a stark reminder of my role in his life now, a laundress, a housekeeper, a convenience, an unpaid, live-in service provider. A cold, heavy stone settled in my stomach. It was a familiar feeling, one I had been swallowing down for years. The slow, creeping realization that the love and energy I had poured into my children had not been an investment that yielded returns of affection and care, but a resource they had simply consumed. They had taken their fill and moved on, leaving the well to run dry. They didn't see me, Beth, the woman who loved classical music and had a secret passion for detective novels, the woman who had once dreamed of traveling to Italy. They saw Mom, a figure from their past who was supposed to be perpetually available in the background of their busy lives, a safety net they could fall back on without ever having to check if the net was still strong. I picked up the note. The paper felt flimsy and insignificant in my hand, yet it carried the weight of 1,000 similar slights, 1,000 moments of being overlooked, 1,000 unspoken assumptions. I thought of Linda's call last week. She'd spent 15 minutes complaining about her demanding boss and her husband's golf habit before ending with, "Oh, gotta run, the kids are hungry. Talk later." She never asked how I was. Not really. She asked, "Everything okay?" Which was a question designed to receive a one-word answer, "Fine." Anything more would have been an inconvenience. I stared at the note, at Mark's confident, dismissive script. The conference. The laundry. The utter lack of consideration. Something inside me, something that had been dormant for a very long time, began to stir. It was a tiny flicker of anger, hot and sharp. For years, my emotional landscape had been a placid lake of quiet resignation and gentle melancholy. But this note, this simple, thoughtless scrap of paper, was a stone tossed into that lake, and the ripples were starting to spread. I crumpled the note in my fist. The paper crackled in protest. The camera of my memory zoomed in on my face, and I know what it would have seen. Not the composed, placid mask I usually wore to hide the hurt. It would have seen the cracks forming, the quiet devastation giving way to a gathering storm. This kitchen, this mundane, sunlit room, suddenly felt like a stage, and the first act of a long-overdue drama was about to begin. The main character, a woman named Beth, was finally starting to read a new script, one she was going to have to write for herself. The silence had been screaming for years, but for the first time, I was starting to understand what it was saying. It was saying, "Enough." I walked over to the trash can, my steps deliberate. I opened the lid and dropped the crumpled note inside. It was a small gesture, invisible to anyone but me. But it felt monumental. It was a refusal. The first of many. I would not be doing Mark's laundry. He was a 45-year-old man. He could figure it out. My hand rested on the lid of the trash can, and a strange, unfamiliar sensation washed over me. It wasn't happiness, not yet. It was a feeling far more potent, more foundational. It was the feeling of a boundary being drawn, a line in the sand of my own heart. And as I stood there in the silent kitchen, I realized this wasn't an ending. It was the beginning of the break. The quiet rebellion had begun, and I had no idea where it would lead, only that I could not, would not, go back to the way things were. The silence was still there, but now, it felt different. It felt like space. Space for me. The rest of the day unfolded with a peculiar, heightened clarity. The routines that usually numbed me now seemed alien and strange. I ate my lunch, a tuna sandwich and a glass of iced tea, at the small kitchen table, the silence pressing in. But instead of feeling lonely, I felt a strange sense of observation, as if I were watching a character in a play. The character was me. I watched her eat her solitary meal. I watched her rinse her plate and place it back in the rack, next to the other single plate. I saw the tremor in her hand and understood it wasn't just age, it was a lifetime of suppressed emotion finally beginning to surface. In the afternoon, I went out to the garden. My garden was my sanctuary, the one place where my efforts yielded visible, beautiful results. I knelt on my padded kneeler, the damp earth cool against my knees, and began to weed the petunia bed. The flowers were vibrant, a riot of pinks and purples, their faces turned up to the sun. Unlike my children, they asked for so little, just water, sunlight, and a bit of care, and in return, they gave back so much beauty. My hands, which had felt so old and useless in the kitchen, felt capable here. I pulled a stubborn stalk of crabgrass, its roots clinging tenaciously to the soil. As I tossed it aside, a memory surfaced, unbidden and sharp. It was from about 15 years ago. Linda had just started college, a prestigious private university that was costing us a fortune. I had a part-time job at a local library, a job I adored. It wasn't much, but the money was mine, and I was saving it for a trip to Italy. I had a drawer hidden in my closet, and every week I'd add a little more to it. I had travel brochures tucked into my nightstand. I could almost taste the pasta, smell the lemon groves of Sorrento. Then Linda called, crying. She wanted to join a study abroad program in Spain. It was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, she'd said, but it was expensive. Robert and I had already stretched our budget to the limit for her tuition. I remembered the conversation as if it were yesterday. Robert and I sitting at this very kitchen table, the weight of the decision heavy between us. "We can't afford it, Beth," he had said, his face etched with worry. I knew he was right. But then I looked at the picture of Linda on the wall, her bright, hopeful face. And I thought of my Italy jar. That night, I went to my closet, took out the jar, and emptied it onto the bed. It was enough for her plane ticket and a little extra. I never told her where the money came from. I just said we'd found a way. She had been ecstatic. She went to Spain and had the time of her life. I put the travel brochures in a box in the attic. I never took the library job again. I started babysitting instead, because it paid better and I could contribute more to the family pot. I had sacrificed my dream for hers, and I had done it gladly. That's what mothers did. But now, kneeling in my garden, the memory felt different. It wasn't a heartwarming story of maternal sacrifice. It was a transaction where I had given up a piece of myself, and the recipient had never even known the cost. She had accepted the gift as her due, without a backward glance. The crabgrass I had just pulled seemed symbolic. I had been weeding my children's lives for years, pulling out the difficult things, smoothing their paths, while my own garden became overgrown and neglected. The afternoon sun began to dip lower, casting long shadows across the lawn. I heard the sound of a car in the driveway, my neighbor, Eleanor, returning from her weekly outing with her daughter. I could hear their laughter as they got out of the car, the easy, familiar cadence of their conversation. They were carrying grocery bags, and her daughter was chattering about a movie they had seen. A sharp, bitter pang of envy shot through me. It was an ugly feeling, and I was ashamed of it, but I couldn't push it away. That was what I missed. Not grand gestures or expensive gifts. Just that. The easy companionship. The feeling of being a welcome part of someone's day. Later that evening, the house was quiet again. Mark was in his room, the blue light of his laptop flickering under the door. He hadn't emerged for dinner. I'd made a chicken pot pie, his favorite, but he'd sent me a text at 7 p.m, "Sorry, Mom. Swamped with work. Just gonna grab a protein bar." I had looked at the beautiful, golden-crusted pie sitting on the counter, made with love, made with the assumption that we would share a meal. I had taken a slice for myself and wrapped the rest in foil, my hands moving with a slow, deliberate precision. I was no longer just sad. I was angry. It was a cold, hard anger that was beginning to feel like a shield. I went into the living room and sat in my armchair, the one Robert used to favor. The television was off. I didn't want the noise. I wanted to sit in the silence and listen to what it was telling me. I thought about the past, about all the sacrifices, big and small. The Italy trip. The endless hours of unpaid babysitting so Linda and her husband could have date nights. The retirement funds we dipped into to give Mark a down payment for his first house, the house his ex-wife now lived in. It had always been done out of love, a fierce, protective, all-encompassing love. But looking at it now, through the lens of this new, painful clarity, I could see a pattern of neglect, of entitlement, of emotional abandonment. They weren't bad people. I knew that. They were just thoughtless. They had moved on with their lives, and I had remained stuck, the designated caregiver, the emotional touchstone they only reached for when they needed something. My loneliness was no longer a vague ache, it was a specific, diagnosed condition. It was the result of being left behind. My days were marked by a suffocating routine. I'd wake up, have my solitary breakfast, tend to the house and garden, watch a bit of daytime television, maybe read a chapter of a book. The highlight of my week was supposed to be a visit from my daughter, a visit that now happened once a month, if I was lucky. I volunteered at the church thrift shop on Thursdays, sorting through other people's discarded belongings. It felt fitting. I spent my days sifting through things that were no longer wanted, no longer valued. I tried to fill the emptiness. I joined a book club, but the other women mostly talked about their grandchildren's latest achievements. I tried a water aerobics class at the community center, but my arthritis made it painful. Every attempt to build a new life for myself felt like trying to build a house on sand. The foundation, my family, my identity as a mother, had crumbled, and I didn't know what to build on in its place. That night, sleep eluded me. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the shadows from the trees outside dancing like specters on the wall. I thought about Robert. He would have been so angry to see how things were. He had always been my champion, the one who would say, "Beth, you need to take a break. Let the kids fend for themselves for a night." He had seen me, truly seen me. Without him, I had become invisible. It was in that dark, lonely room, somewhere in the small hours of the morning, that the second crack appeared in the dam. The anger I'd felt earlier had cooled into a hard, clear resolve. It wasn't enough to just feel angry. It wasn't enough to just drop a note in the trash. That was passive defiance. It was time for active change. I didn't know what it would look like, but I knew I had to do something. I had to have a conversation. I had to use my voice, even if it shook, even if they didn't want to hear what it had to say. The loneliness was a disease, but I was starting to suspect there was a cure. And the cure was not going to come from them. It had to come from me. I finally drifted off to sleep, but it was a restless, dream-filled sleep. I dreamed I was in a garden, but it was barren and dry. I was holding a watering can, but it was empty. And in the distance, I could hear my children laughing, their voices carried on the wind, oblivious. The dream was a nightmare, but when I woke up, the sun was streaming in, and I didn't feel fear. I felt a strange sense of purpose. The dream was a warning, but it was also a map. It showed me the barren landscape of my life, and I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I was the only one who held the seeds to make it bloom again. The next step was to find the water. And that meant I had to talk to my son. Not as his laundress, not as his housekeeper, but as his mother, a woman on the verge of taking her life back. The thought was terrifying, but it was also the first glimmer of true hope I had felt in years. A week passed. A week in which I performed my new, quiet rebellion. I did not do Mark's laundry. The hamper at the bottom of the stairs overflowed, a silent testament to my defiance. He didn't mention it. He simply appeared one evening in a shirt that was noticeably wrinkled and left the next morning with a bag from the 24-hour dry cleaner. We were like two ships passing in the night, communicating only through passive-aggressive gestures and unspoken resentments. The pot pie I had made sat in the refrigerator, a slowly decaying monument to my wasted efforts, until I finally threw it out. The act of scraping it into the garbage felt both wasteful and profoundly liberating. The catalyst I had been waiting for, the moment to break my silence, came on a Saturday morning. I was in the kitchen, nursing a cup of coffee, when my phone rang. It was Linda. My heart gave a little leap of hope, a stupid, reflexive thing. Maybe she was calling just to chat. "Hi, Mom," she said, her voice rushed, the sound of her kids shouting in the background. "Listen, I know this is super last minute, but Tom and I have a chance to go to a wine tasting event this afternoon with some of his work colleagues. It's a huge networking thing for him. Is there any chance you could watch the kids for a few hours? From like 1 to 5?" There it was. The request, wrapped in a flimsy excuse. Not "Hey, how are you?" Not a "What are you doing today?" Just a need. In the past, I would have said yes without hesitation. I would have rearranged my entire date to accommodate her. But the woman who had crumpled that note from Mark was still in charge. I took a deep breath. "I'm sorry, Linda, I can't today. I have plans." There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. It was so complete I thought for a moment the call had dropped. "You have plans?" she finally said, her tone a mixture of disbelief and irritation. What plans? The question was so revealing. The assumption that my life was an empty slate, waiting for her to write on it. "I have my own things to do," I said, my voice calmer than I felt. "You'll have to find someone else." "But the regular sitter is out of town." "Mom, this is really important for Tom's career. It's just 4 hours." Her voice was wheedling now, the tone she used to use as a child when she wanted a new toy. "I understand, dear, but the answer is no," I said. My heart was pounding, a frantic drum against my ribs. It felt like I was defusing a bomb. "You should have called sooner." "Fine," she snapped, her voice turning cold. "Just fine. I'll figure something out." She hung up without another word. I put the phone down, my hand trembling. I hadn't shouted. I hadn't made a scene. I had simply said no. And it felt like I had detonated a grenade in the middle of our relationship. I sank into a kitchen chair, the adrenaline leaving me shaky and weak. But underneath the fear, that flicker of anger I had felt before was glowing brighter. It was turning into a quiet, steady flame of self-respect. The house was silent for the rest of the morning. Around noon, I heard Mark's footsteps on the stairs. He came into the kitchen, wearing sweatpants and a t-shirt, his hair a mess. He looked exhausted. He opened the refrigerator, stared into it for a full minute, and then closed it with a sigh. "Nothing to eat," he muttered, more to himself than to me. "I haven't been to the store yet," I said simply. He turned to look at me, really look at me, for the first time in days. There was an expression of mild annoyance on his face. "Linda called," he said. "She was pretty upset. Said you wouldn't watch the kids." It was a statement, but it was also an accusation. "You failed in your duties. You upset the system." "That's right," I said, my voice even. "I had other plans." He let out a short, humorless laugh. "What plans, Mom? Your book club? Rearranging the doilies?" And that was it. That was the spark that lit the fuse. The condescension, the complete and utter dismissal of my life, of my personhood. The years of swallowing my hurt, of making myself small to accommodate their large, important lives, came rushing to the surface. The dam didn't just crack, it burst. "My plans," I said, my voice low and shaking with a fury that surprised even me, "are none of your business. My life does not exist to be a convenience for you and your sister." Mark's eyebrows shot up. He was so taken aback that he was speechless for a moment. "Whoa, Mom. Where's this coming from?" It was just a simple question. "No, it wasn't a simple question, Mark. It was a judgment. The same judgment you both have been making for years. That my time isn't valuable. That my needs don't matter. That I am just here. The house manager. The laundress. The emergency babysitter. The short-term loan officer." I stood up, my body trembling, but my resolve as solid as granite. "When was the last time you asked me how I was and actually listened to the answer? When was the last time either of you did anything for me, without it being a transaction? I made you a pot pie on Tuesday, your favorite. You couldn't be bothered to come out of your room to share a meal with your mother. You left me a note, Mark, a command to do your laundry, as if I were your hired help. And you have the audacity to question my plans?" The words poured out of me, a torrent of pain and resentment that had been building for years. I was no longer the quiet, accommodating mother he knew. I was a stranger in my own kitchen, a woman he had never met. He stared at me, his mouth slightly agape. He looked like a fish out of water. "Mom. I've been under a lot of stress. The divorce, work. I didn't realize." "That's the entire point," I interrupted, my voice rising. "You didn't realize. You didn't think to realize. You walk into this house, your childhood home, And you don't see me. You see a utility. A service. A ghost who takes care of things so you don't have to. Your sister is the same. She calls only when she needs something. My grandchildren barely know who I am because she can't be bothered to bring them to see the old woman unless she needs a free babysitter. The hurt was raw in my voice now, the anger laced with a profound, bottomless sorrow. I have given you my entire life. I gave up my dreams, my hobbies, my savings, everything, so that you two could have the best of everything. And I did it with love. But I never thought that love would be a one-way street. I never thought I would end up so utterly alone in a house that is supposed to be full of family. I was crying now, hot tears streaming down my face. But they weren't tears of weakness. They were tears of rage, of grief, of a final, painful catharsis. Mark just stood there, stunned into silence. The confident, in charge man was gone, replaced by a confused boy who was being confronted with a truth he had never considered. For years, I had been invisible. Now, I was a roaring fire in the middle of his comfortable, convenient world, and he had no idea how to put me out. I think, I said, my voice dropping but losing none of its intensity, that it's time for you to find your own apartment, Mark. I think it's time for you to get back on your own 2 feet. For real this time. The finality in my tone hung in the air between us, as sharp and clear as shattered glass. This wasn't a suggestion. It was an eviction notice. Not just from my house, but from the role he had assigned me in his life. The conversation, this terrible, beautiful, painful conversation, had changed everything. I had taken the deepest pain of my life, the pain of being unseen, and I had held it up to the light for him to see. I didn't know if he could truly understand it. I didn't know if he and Linda could ever change. But as I stood there, shaking and crying in my sunlit kitchen, I knew one thing for sure. I had changed. The transformation was excruciating, but it had begun. And for the first time, the future didn't feel like an endless stretch of silent, lonely days. It felt like a blank page. And I was finally holding the pen. The aftermath of my outburst was a silence more profound than any that had come before. It was a heavy, charged silence, thick with unspoken thoughts and seismic shifts in the familiar landscape of our family. Mark didn't argue. He didn't defend himself further. He simply stared at me for a long moment, his face a canvas of shock and a dawning, uncomfortable comprehension. Then, without a word, he turned and walked back upstairs. The soft thud of his bedroom door closing was like a judge's gavel. A verdict had been rendered. I was left alone in the kitchen, trembling, my body humming with the residual energy of the confrontation. I felt drained, as if I had run a marathon. I sank back into my chair and buried my face in my hands, the tears finally subsiding into ragged, hiccuping breaths. Part of me was terrified. I had just blown up my life, or at least, the life I had known. I had pushed away both of my children in the space of a few hours. A voice of doubt whispered in my ear, the familiar, insidious voice of a lifetime of conditioning. You've gone too far. You're being cruel. They'll never speak to you again. You'll die alone. But another voice, a newer, stronger one, pushed back. What were you before? You were alone even when they were here. That thought was a bedrock of truth I could stand on. I had confronted the pain, and I had survived. I had spoken my truth, and the world hadn't ended. In fact, for the first time in a very long time, I felt like my world was just beginning. I decided I needed to get out of the house. The walls felt like they were closing in, saturated with the toxic emotions that had been spilled. I changed my clothes, grabbed my purse and car keys, and walked out, not knowing or caring where I was going. I just drove. I drove through familiar neighborhoods, past the park where I used to take the kids, past their old elementary school. These places, which usually brought a pang of sweet nostalgia, now looked different. They were scenes from a life I was leaving behind. I found myself on the road leading out of town, towards the countryside. On impulse, I pulled into the parking lot of a dusty, old antique mall, a place I hadn't visited in years. I needed to be surrounded by things that had a past, things that had survived. Inside, the air smelled of old wood, aging paper, and polish. I wandered through the aisles, my fingers ghosting over the surfaces of forgotten treasures. A silver-backed hairbrush. A stack of yellowed postcards with faded, elegant script. A child's worn wooden horse. Each object had a story. Each object had been held, used, and loved, and then let go. There was a melancholy to it, but also a sense of peace. Life moves on. Things change. In a small, cluttered booth in the back, I saw it. A small, wooden writing desk. It was nothing fancy, probably from the 1940s. It was made of dark cherry wood, with elegant, tapered legs and a few small drawers with brass pulls. It was covered in scratches and water rings, a testament to a life of use. But it had good bones. It was sturdy, and honest. I ran my hand over the smooth, worn surface. I imagined someone sitting here, writing letters, paying bills, perhaps penning a diary. I thought of my own unspoken thoughts, the years of feelings I had swallowed. A woman with a kind, wrinkled face and a cascade of gray hair pinned up in a messy bun came over. She was the owner of the booth. "She's a beauty, isn't she?" she said, her voice warm. "Got a lot of stories in that old wood, I bet." "Yes," I said, my voice a little hoarse. "She is." On a complete and utter impulse, I bought the desk. It was an extravagance I couldn't really afford, but the need for it felt primal. It was more than a piece of furniture, it was a symbol. It was a place for me. A place for my voice. The two men from the shop delivered it that afternoon. I had them put it in the spare bedroom, the one that had become a repository for old junk and boxes of things I couldn't bear to part with. After they left, I stood in the doorway and looked at the desk, sitting in a pool of afternoon sunlight. Mark was still in his room. The house was quiet. I spent the next 2 hours clearing out that room. I was ruthless. I threw out old magazines, broken lamps, clothes I hadn't worn in a decade. I filled 6 large trash bags. Then, I found a box tucked away in the back of the closet. It was labeled Beth's Things. I hesitated for a moment before opening it. Inside were the ghosts of the woman I used to be. My old painting supplies, the brushes stiff, the paints dried into hard, colorful discs. My collection of classical music on vinyl, records I hadn't listened to since Robert died because it was our music. And at the bottom, a simple, leather-bound journal. I opened it. The first few pages were filled with my handwriting from 30 years ago, detailing my hopes for my young family, my love for Robert, a sketch of a flower I'd seen in the garden. Then, the pages became blank. I had stopped writing when the kids got older, when my life became consumed by theirs. I carried the journal over to my new desk and sat down. The chair was hard, but the desk felt perfect. It felt like coming home to a place I had never been. I opened the journal to the first blank page. My hand felt unsteady as I picked up a pen. What would I even write? Where would I begin? I started with the truth. Today, I told my son to move out. Today, I told my daughter no. For the first time in my life, I feel like I am standing on solid ground, even though the whole world is shaking. The words came, clumsy at first, then flowing like a river breaking through a dam. I wrote about the pot pie. I wrote about the laundry. I wrote about the phone call with Linda. I wrote about the Italy jar. I wrote about my loneliness, my anger, my deep, profound hurt. I didn't try to be eloquent. I just let the pain spill out onto the page. I filled page after page, my hand aching, the ink bleeding into the paper. I was confronting the pain, not as a vague, abstract sadness, but as a series of specific wounds, each one with a name and a date. As I wrote, I began to see the pattern clearly. It wasn't that my children were evil. It was a system we had all created. I had taught them that my needs came last. I had taught them that my well was bottomless. I had done it out of love, but the result was a toxic dependency where I was the perpetual giver and they were the perpetual takers. And the only person who could break that system was me. I wrote until the sun went down and the room was filled with shadows. My hand was cramping, and my eyes were sore from crying. But I felt a sense of clarity I hadn't experienced in years. The journal wasn't a magic cure. It didn't take the pain away. But it gave it a place to live, a place outside of my own body. By writing it down, I was externalizing it. I was acknowledging it. I was validating my own experience. That night, Mark slid an envelope under my bedroom door. I opened it. Inside was a piece of paper. It wasn't a note. It was a printout from an apartment listing website. At the top, he had written, "I'll be out by the end of the month. I'm sorry, Mom." It wasn't a conversation. It wasn't the deep, emotional breakthrough I might have fantasized about. But it was a start. It was an acknowledgement. He had heard me. I tucked the paper into my new journal. It was the first document of my new life. My journey of healing had just begun, and it was going to be a long and difficult road. But as I sat at my little wooden desk, in my newly cleared-out room, I knew I had taken the most important step. I had found my voice, and I had started to listen to it. The pain was still there, a deep, resonant ache in my soul, but for the first time, it was accompanied by a powerful, unyielding companion, hope. The days following the confrontation were a strange mix of liberation and terror. The house was quieter than ever, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was no longer the suffocating silence of neglect, it was the clean, empty silence of a space being cleared. Mark was rarely seen. He was a phantom who left for work early and came home late, holing up in his room. The sounds I did hear were those of purpose, the opening and closing of drawers, the rustle of boxes, the subtle sounds of a life being packed up. We existed in a state of polite, fragile truce. No more accusations, but no real conversation either. The apology he had written on the apartment listing felt like a period at the end of a long, painful chapter, but the next page was still unnervingly blank. My note to Linda had also created a chasm of silence. A week went by with no calls, no texts. Before, this silence would have terrified me, sending me into a spiral of guilt and anxiety. I would have been the one to reach out, to smooth things over, to apologize for having needs of my own. But now, I held my ground. The new, firm bedrock of self-respect I was building was still precarious, and I knew that one step backward could cause the whole structure to crumble. So I focused on what I could control, my own life, my own space. My new desk became my anchor. Every morning, I would sit down with my journal and write. I wrote about my past, dredging up memories I had long suppressed. I wrote about my fears for the future. And most importantly, I wrote about my present. I documented the small, seismic shifts in my daily existence. One afternoon, I was struggling to move a heavy box of old books from the spare room. My back twinged in protest, and I had to sit down, frustrated. My first instinct was to think, Mark could have done this in 2 seconds. The thought was immediately followed by a wave of the old resentment. But then, a new thought emerged. I can hire someone to do this. It was a revelation. I didn't need to depend on him, or anyone. I had my own money, Robert's life insurance and my small pension. I had always been so careful with it, saving it for an emergency or for the kids. I realized with a jolt that this was the emergency. My own well-being. The next day, I called a local handyman service. A pleasant young man named David came over. He was strong and efficient, and he listened patiently as I explained what I needed moved and discarded. He didn't make me feel old or incapable. He simply did the job I paid him to do. As he was leaving, he noticed my overgrown rose bushes near the porch. "Those are lovely bushes, ma'am," he said. "They just need a hard pruning if you want them to bloom well next season." "I know," I sighed. "My arthritis makes it so difficult these days." "Well," he said, handing me his card, "I do yard work too. If you ever need a hand, just give me a call." It was a simple business transaction, but it felt like a lifeline. I was learning that I could create a support system for myself, one that wasn't based on guilt, obligation, or the whims of my children. I could pay for help. It was a powerful and liberating realization. The following Thursday, Linda called. Her voice was strained, stripped of its usual breezy confidence. "Hi, Mom." "Hello, Linda," I said, my voice neutral. I sat down at my desk, my journal open in front of me as if for moral support. "So, Mark told me he's moving out." It was a statement, but the unspoken question hung in the air. "What did you do?" "Yes, that's right," I said calmly. There was a pause. I could hear her take a breath. "Look, Mom, I know you're mad about the babysitting thing." "Linda," I interrupted gently, "this isn't about one babysitting request. You have to know that." "Then what is it?" she asked, and for the first time, I heard a note of genuine confusion in her voice, not just irritation. "I don't understand why you're suddenly being so difficult." Difficult. The word stung, but I didn't let it derail me. "I'm not being difficult, dear. I am setting boundaries. For years, my entire life has revolved around the needs of you and your brother. I have been your constant, reliable backup plan. And I have done it without a single complaint. But I am 68 years old. I am tired. And I am lonely. I am not a service you can turn on and off when it's convenient for you. I am a person. And I need to start living my own life." I explained, as calmly as I could, how her infrequent calls and her last-minute requests made me feel. I didn't accuse. I used I statements. "I feel hurt when you don't ask about my life. I feel taken for granted when you assume I have no plans of my own." She was quiet for a long time. I could almost hear the gears turning in her head, processing a perspective she had never been forced to consider. I never thought of it that way," she said finally, her voice small. "I'm just so busy, with the kids and work. I just assumed you were fine. You always seemed fine." "I know," I said, a wave of sadness washing over me. "That's my fault, too. I never taught you any different. I always pretended to be fine. But I'm not. And I can't do it anymore. I can't be the person you all expect me to be, because she doesn't exist anymore. She's been wrung dry." It was a raw, honest admission. There was another long silence. "So what does this mean?" Linda asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Are you cutting us off?" The fear in her voice was palpable, and it tugged at my heart. But I had to stay strong. "No, Linda. I am not cutting you off. I love you and I love my grandchildren. But the terms of our relationship have to change. My support will no longer be unconditional and on demand. My financial help is no longer on the table. You and Tom are adults with good jobs, and my funds are for my own care and my own life. And my time is my own. If you want to see me, I would love that. But you will have to make time for me, just as you would for any other important relationship in your life. You will have to call me, plan visits, and be a daughter, not just a person who needs a favor." I laid it all out, clearly and without apology. The new rules of engagement. I was establishing my own personal constitution, and the preamble was "I matter." "Okay," she whispered. "Okay, Mom. I hear you." It wasn't a magical fix. It wasn't a tearful reunion over the phone. But it was a conversation, a real one. It was a boundary clearly drawn and, for the first time, acknowledged. When we hung up, I felt a profound sense of relief. It was painful, this process of redefining my role, of demanding to be seen. It was the hardest work I had ever done. But it was also the most necessary. At the end of the month, Mark moved out. He hired movers, and I stayed in my room, giving him space. When the truck was loaded and he was ready to leave, he knocked on my door. I came out, and we stood in the now empty hallway. "Well," he said, shifting his weight awkwardly. "I guess that's it." "I hope you'll be happy in your new place," I said sincerely. He looked at me, his eyes full of a complex mixture of guilt, resentment, and a flicker of something I hadn't seen before, respect. "Mom. About what you said. I've been thinking about it a lot. You were right. I was being a jerk. I took you for granted. And I'm sorry." The apology, spoken to my face, was more than I had expected. I simply nodded, accepting it. The wounds were too deep to be healed by a single sorry, but it was a salve nonetheless. "I'd like to, take you out to dinner next week," he said, his eyes on the floor. "If you're not busy." The last part was said with a hint of self-conscious irony. I allowed myself a small smile. "I'll check my calendar, Mark," I said. "Call me." He nodded, gave me a quick, clumsy hug, and left. I closed the door behind him and leaned against it, the silence of the house complete. But this time, it was a beautiful, peaceful, promising silence. The house was mine. My life was mine. I had set my boundaries, and in doing so, I had not pushed my children away. I had simply forced them to find a new way to approach me, a way that required respect. The process was messy and agonizing, but I was no longer just surviving. I was beginning to build. In the weeks after Mark moved out and my conversation with Linda cleared the air, a new kind of quiet settled over my house. It was a chosen quiet, a peaceful solitude that I began to cherish. The absence of my son's heavy footsteps and the constant pressure of his unspoken needs was like a weight lifted from my shoulders. The house felt bigger, brighter. It felt like mine again. I spent time reclaiming the space. I moved the furniture around in the living room, arranging it for my own comfort, not for a crowd. I turned Mark's old room into a proper guest room, but with the implicit understanding that it was for guests, not for long-term residents. And my little office, with its cherry wood desk, became the true heart of my home. My journal was my confidant, but I knew I needed more. The pain of the past couldn't be exorcised by writing alone. I needed to reconnect with the world, with the woman I was before I became mom. I thought about the box in the attic labeled Beth's Things. One rainy afternoon, I pulled it down and unpacked my old life. There they were, my vinyl records. I hadn't owned a working record player in years. The next day, I went to an electronics store and bought a simple, modern turntable. I brought it home, hooked it up, and pulled a record from its sleeve. It was Vivaldi's Four Seasons. As I lowered the needle, the first familiar notes filled the room, crackling with the warm, imperfect sound of vinyl. I closed my eyes, and I was transported. I was 25 again, dancing in the living room with Robert, both of us young and full of dreams. The music didn't just bring sadness, it brought back the joy, the love, the vibrant life we had shared. It was a part of me I had locked away, and listening to it now felt like welcoming an old friend home. Next, I tackled the painting supplies. The old paints were a lost cause, but the brushes could be salvaged. I spent an afternoon soaking and cleaning them, the scent of turpentine sharp and nostalgic. I went to the art supply store, a place I hadn't set foot in for over 30 years, and felt a thrill of excitement. I bought fresh tubes of oil paints, cerulean blue, cadmium yellow, burnt sienna, and a set of new canvases. My first attempts at painting were clumsy. My hands felt stiff, my eyes unsure. I tried to paint a vase of flowers from my garden, and it looked like a child's finger painting. I was frustrated, ready to give up. But then I remembered why I had stopped in the first place. I was so busy taking care of everyone else that I had no time or energy left for myself. This time was different. This time, there was no one to take care of but me. I decided to sign up for a community art class. It was a terrifying step. I was sure I would be the oldest and least talented person there. And on the first day, I was. The class was filled with young, energetic people and a few women my age who had clearly been painting for years. I almost turned and walked out, but the instructor, a gentle woman named Maria, came over and looked at my stiff, awkward setup. "It's just about making a mark," she said with a smile. "Don't worry about making it pretty. Just feel the paint, feel the brush. See what happens." Her words gave me permission to fail. I started just playing with the colors, mixing them on the palette, spreading them on the canvas. I wasn't trying to paint anything in particular. I was just exploring. And slowly, something began to loosen inside me. The joy of creation, pure and simple, started to bubble up. I met a woman in that class named Carol. She was a widow, like me, with a dry wit and eyes that sparkled with mischief. She painted bold, abstract canvases full of color and emotion. She looked at my tentative floral paintings and said, "You've got a good eye for color, Beth. But you're holding back. Let it rip." Carol and I started having coffee after class. For the first time in years, I had a friend who wasn't connected to my old life, to my children, or to the church. She saw me as Beth, the aspiring painter, not as Mark and Linda's mother. We talked about everything, our late husbands, our frustrations with getting older, our secret dreams. I told her about my struggles with my children. "Kids," she said, stirring her latte with a sigh. "You spend 18 years trying to get them to stand on their own 2 feet, and the rest of your life trying to get them to stop walking all over you. Setting boundaries isn't a one-time thing, honey. It's a full-time job." Her pragmatic, humorous take on it was refreshing. She made me feel less alone. She validated my feelings without pity. Our friendship became a vital part of my healing. It was a relationship of equals, a place where I could be myself, flaws and all. My relationship with my children was slowly, cautiously, being rebuilt on new ground. Mark called and took me to dinner at a quiet Italian restaurant. It was awkward at first. We fumbled for conversation. But then he started asking me about my week. I told him about my art class, about my new friend Carol. I saw a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He was seeing me as a person with a life, with interests that had nothing to do with him. He talked about his new apartment, the struggles of setting up a new life on his own. He was complaining, but it was different now. He was talking to me like another adult, not just a maternal sounding board. Linda started calling once a week, usually on Sunday afternoons. She would put me on speakerphone with the grandkids, and I could hear them chatter about school and friends. Then she would take the phone and ask about my week. The calls were still sometimes rushed, but the effort was there. One Saturday, she called and said, "Hey Mom, the kids and I are going to the farmer's market. We were wondering if you'd like to join us." No agenda, just thought it would be nice to walk around. My heart swelled. It was the first time she had invited me to do something that wasn't centered around her own needs. It was a simple invitation, an offering. "I would love that," I said. The day at the market was lovely. My granddaughter, Chloe, held my hand. My grandson, Ben, excitedly showed me all the different kinds of pumpkins. Linda and I chatted easily as we browsed the stalls. I bought a bouquet of sunflowers, and she insisted on carrying them for me. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of awkwardness, reminders of the distance that had grown between us. But it was a start. It was a bridge being built, plank by plank, across the chasm that had separated us. I was rediscovering my passions, but more than that, I was rediscovering myself. I was no longer just a mother, a widow, a housekeeper. I was Beth. I was a painter, a music lover, a gardener, a friend. My identity was no longer solely defined by my relationships to other people. It was being forged in the quiet moments at my desk, in the laughter shared with a new friend, in the simple joy of spreading color on a blank canvas. The emptiness that had once consumed me was slowly being filled, not by the attention of others, but by the substance of my own life. I was finding that the fulfillment I had spent years trying to get from my children was something I could only give to myself. One crisp autumn afternoon, about 6 months after Mark had moved out, I was in my little office, working on a painting. It was different from my earlier, hesitant florals. This one was bolder, more abstract, inspired by my friend Carol. It was a swirl of deep blues and purples, with a defiant slash of brilliant, sunny yellow cutting through the darkness. It was a painting of my own emotional landscape. There was a knock on the front door. I wasn't expecting anyone. I wiped my hands on a rag and went to answer it. It was Linda, standing on the porch alone. Her face was pale, and her eyes were red-rimmed, as if she had been crying. My first instinct, the old maternal panic, kicked in. "What is it? What's wrong? Are the kids okay?" I asked, my hand flying to my chest. "The kids are fine, Mom," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "They're at a friend's house. Can I come in for a minute?" "Of course," I said, stepping back to let her in. She walked into the living room and sank onto the sofa, looking small and lost. I sat in the armchair opposite her, my mind racing. What could be so wrong? Tom and I had a huge fight last night, she began, her voice cracking. A really bad one. He's been working so much, he's never home. I feel like I'm doing everything by myself. The house, the kids, all of it. I told him I was drowning, that I needed him to step up, to see me. And he looked at me and said, "I don't know what you're talking about. Everything seems fine to me." She looked up at me, her eyes brimming with tears. "He doesn't see me, Mom. He doesn't see how much I'm struggling. It's like I'm invisible." The word hung in the air between us. Invisible. It was as if I was looking in a mirror that reflected the past 20 years of my own life. The same pain, the same bewilderment, the same cry of the heart. All my old resentments, the anger I had harbored towards her, simply evaporated in that moment. All I saw was my daughter, hurting in the exact same way I had been. I got up, sat next to her on the sofa, and put my arm around her. She leaned into me and began to sob, great, wrenching sobs that shook her whole body. I just held her, stroking her hair, the way I used to when she was a little girl with a skinned knee. I didn't say, "I told you so." I didn't say, "Now you know how it feels." I just offered her comfort. When her tears finally subsided, she pulled back, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Don't be sorry," I said gently. She looked at me, her gaze searching my face. "How did you do it, Mom?" she asked. "How did you live with that feeling for so long?" The question was a punch to the gut, but it was an honest one. "Not very well," I admitted. "I let it eat me alive for years. I pretended I was fine, until I just couldn't pretend anymore." We sat in silence for a few minutes, the shared understanding a palpable thing between us. When you set those boundaries with me and Mark," she said, her voice hesitant, "I was so angry. I thought you were being selfish. I thought you were punishing us. But now I think I get it. You weren't punishing us. You were saving yourself." A tear escaped my eye and rolled down my cheek. To hear her say it, to know that she finally, truly understood the depth of my decision, was a moment of profound, breathtaking healing. It was the validation I had craved for so long, and it was coming not because I had demanded it, but because she had arrived at the truth through her own pain. "I was so wrapped up in my own world," she continued, her voice full of remorse. "My own stress, my own busyness. I just took you for granted. I treated you exactly the way Tom is treating me now. Like a function, not a person. And I am so sorry, Mom. For all the years I didn't see you." This apology was different from the others. It wasn't a reaction to my anger. It was born of her own empathy, her own dawning self-awareness. It was the apology that healed the deepest wound. "I love you, Linda," I said, my voice thick. "And I forgive you." We held each other again, and this time, it felt different. The old roles of the needy daughter and the endlessly giving mother had dissolved. We were just two women, a mother and a daughter, who had both known the pain of being invisible, finding solace and understanding in each other. This moment, this unexpected visit, was a turning point. It wasn't about me winning or her losing. It was about a fundamental shift in our dynamic. She was beginning to see me not just as the mother she had constructed in her mind, but as a woman with her own history, her own struggles, and her own strength. It was a small, quiet moment on a crisp autumn afternoon, but it felt like the earth had shifted on its axis. The gap that had separated us for so long was finally beginning to close, not because I had pulled her across, but because she had taken the brave, painful step to meet me in the middle. The healing process, I realized, wasn't just about me. It was about us. And it had finally, truly begun. The months that followed Linda's visit were like the slow, gentle turning of a season. The raw, painful wounds of the past began to scar over, leaving not ugliness, but a testament to survival. The bitterness I had held onto for so long, the sharp-edged resentment that had been my constant companion, began to soften. It was a slow process, like melting ice. There were still days when a thoughtless comment or a forgotten call would trigger a pang of the old hurt, but it no longer consumed me. It was a passing shadow, not a permanent storm cloud. My journal became less of a place to vent my anger and more of a space for reflection. I started writing down things I was grateful for: the vibrant color of the changing leaves outside my window, a long, laughter-filled coffee date with Carol, the sweet, earthy smell of my garden after a rain. I was actively retraining my brain to look for the good, to focus on the life I was building instead of the one I had lost. The healing came in small, unexpected moments. It came when Mark called me one Tuesday, just to tell me a funny story about his new neighbor. The call had no agenda, no request attached. It was just a son sharing a moment of his life with his mother. It came when Linda sent me a picture of a painting she'd seen in a gallery, with the text, "This made me think of you." It was the simple, profound act of being seen, of being held in their minds when I wasn't physically present. I continued with my art class, and my paintings grew bolder. I was no longer trying to replicate what I saw, I was trying to express what I felt. Maria, my instructor, noticed the change. "Beth," she said one evening, looking at a canvas I had filled with fiery oranges and deep, peaceful greens, "you've found your voice." Her words filled me with a quiet pride. It was true. I had found it in my life, and now it was appearing on my canvas. Carol became my rock. Our friendship was one of the greatest gifts of this new chapter. We took a day trip to the coast, something I hadn't done in years. We walked along the beach, the cold wind whipping our hair, and ate fish and chips out of a paper cone. We talked about our husbands, sharing stories and tears, but also laughter. With her, I could be completely myself. She had never known the old, accommodating Beth, so she only saw the woman I was becoming. She celebrated my victories, no matter how small, and offered a steady, non-judgmental ear for my struggles. "You know," she said to me once, as we were packing up our easels after painting in the park, "the hardest part of losing a spouse isn't the loneliness. It's that you lose the person who holds your memories. The only one who remembers you when you were young." I knew exactly what she meant. "But we're making new memories," I said, looking at our two canvases sitting side by side. "Damn right, we are," she said with a grin. The healing process was also about forgiving myself. I had to let go of the guilt I felt for not speaking up sooner, for allowing the dynamic with my children to become so unbalanced. I had to accept that I had done the best I could with the tools I had at the time. Motherhood, especially for my generation, often came with an unwritten contract of self-sacrifice. I hadn't known another way, but now I did. And forgiving my past self was a crucial step in embracing my future. One of the biggest steps in my healing journey was tackling the legal and financial aspects of my life. For years, my will and power of attorney had named Mark as the sole executor and decision-maker. It had seemed logical at the time. But now, I realized that I had given him power over me that he hadn't earned and that I no longer wanted him to have. I made an appointment with an estate lawyer, a sharp, compassionate woman named Ms. Davis. I explained my situation, my desire to maintain my independence and protect my assets for my own care. She listened patiently, without judgment. "It's a common story, Beth," she said. "More common than you think. You've worked hard your whole life. You have a right to decide what happens with your money and your life." Together, we drafted a new will. I divided my assets equally between Mark and Linda, but I added a trust for the grandchildren's education. Then, we tackled the power of attorney. Instead of naming one of my children, I appointed a professional fiduciary from a trusted local agency to act as my agent if I became incapacitated. "This way," Ms. Davis explained, "decisions about your health and finances will be made by a neutral third party, whose only job is to act in your best interest. It takes the burden and the potential for conflict off your children." It was a bold move, and I knew it might hurt their feelings. But it was also the ultimate boundary. It was me, taking care of my future self. It was a declaration that I was in charge of my own life, until the very end. I left her office feeling 10 feet tall. I had taken control not just of my emotional well-being, but of my practical, legal reality. Letting go of the bitterness was the final, most difficult piece of the puzzle. It had been a shield for so long, protecting me from the pain. But I came to realize it was also a poison, eating away at my own happiness. I didn't want to spend my remaining years weighed down by old grievances. I wanted to be light. I wanted to be free. I started a new practice in my journal. Every night, before bed, I would write down one thing I was letting go of. I am letting go of the anger I felt about the Italy trip. I am letting go of the resentment over the missed birthdays. I am letting go of the need for them to understand just how much I sacrifice. It was a slow, deliberate process of unclenching my heart. I was finally realizing that my happiness couldn't be contingent on their apologies or their understanding. My happiness had to be my own creation. The peace I was seeking wasn't going to be given to me. It was something I had to find within. And with each passing day, with each small act of self-care, with each honest conversation and each boundary upheld, I felt that peace growing, a warm, steady light in the center of my being. The relationship between a mother and her children is a living, breathing thing. It shifts and changes, stretches and sometimes breaks. Mine had broken, but now, it was healing into something new. Something stronger, more honest, and built on a foundation of mutual respect. The new dynamic was tested around the holidays. In years past, Thanksgiving and Christmas were my responsibility. I would cook for days, clean the house until it was spotless, and host a huge gathering where I felt more like a caterer than a family member. This year, I decided to do things differently. In early November, I called the family meeting. I asked Mark and Linda to come over for Sunday lunch. Not a big, fancy meal. I ordered pizza. We sat around the kitchen table, a place that had once been a battlefield, and I laid out my proposal. I'm not hosting Thanksgiving or Christmas this year, I said simply. There was a moment of stunned silence. But we always come here, Mark said, looking confused. I know, I said. And I've loved many of those memories. But it's too much for me now. I want to enjoy the holidays too, not just work through them. So, I have an idea. For Thanksgiving, Linda, I was hoping you and Tom would host. And for Christmas, Mark, I thought maybe you could have us at your new apartment. It doesn't have to be fancy. We can all pitch in, make it a potluck. The important thing is that we're together. Linda looked at Tom, who had come with her. He nodded. We can do that, Beth. Of course. Mark looked a little panicked. My apartment is tiny, Mom. That's okay, I said with a smile. We'll be cozy. What matters is that we're shifting the responsibility. It's time for you two to be the hosts. I'm ready to be a guest. It was a revolutionary idea in our family, and it worked. Thanksgiving at Linda's was chaotic and loud, and her turkey was a little dry, but it was wonderful. I got to sit on the sofa and play a board game with my grandkids while she and Tom bustled around the kitchen. I felt a part of the celebration, not just the engine behind it. Christmas at Mark's apartment was even better. It was small, and we were all squeezed around his dining table, but he had made a real effort. He'd bought a little tree and decorated it. He made his famous lasagna. We laughed and told stories. At one point, I looked around the table at the faces of my children and grandchildren, and my heart felt full to bursting. They were seeing me now, not just as Mom, the endlessly capable matriarch, but as Beth. A person in her own right, with her own needs and desires. Someone they needed to make room for. The new boundaries I had set had not pushed them away, they had brought us closer in a more meaningful way. Our conversations were deeper. When Linda had a problem at work, she called me for advice, as she would a trusted friend. When Mark was thinking about dating again, he awkwardly asked me what I thought, valuing my perspective. They were starting to see me as a woman who had lived a life, who had wisdom to share, not just services to provide. The emotional gap that had once felt like a vast, uncrossable canyon was slowly being filled. It was being filled with weekly phone calls, with shared meals that weren't on a major holiday, with small acts of consideration. Linda started sending me photos of the kids' soccer games during the week. Mark would drop by on a Saturday morning with coffee and bagels, just to sit and chat for an hour. These were the things I had yearned for. Not grand gestures, but the small, consistent threads of connection that weave a family together. They were learning to love me on my terms, and in doing so, they were discovering a mother they had never really known. I had also informed them about the changes to my will and power of attorney. I did it calmly, explaining my reasoning. I told them it wasn't a punishment or a sign of mistrust. It was a gift. A gift that would free them from having to make difficult decisions for me and allow them to simply be my children. There was some initial hurt, particularly from Mark, but after they had time to process it, they understood. In a way, it was the final piece of the puzzle, the ultimate declaration of my autonomy. My life had found a new rhythm. My days were filled with things that brought me joy: my art class with Carol, my music, my garden, my journal. My family was a part of that life, a very important part, but they were no longer the entire circumference of it. My happiness was no longer a fragile thing, dependent on their attention. It was a deep, steady well within me. One afternoon, I was in my office, finishing the abstract painting of the blues and purples with the slash of yellow. I signed my name in the corner, Beth. Not Mom, not Grandma. Just my name. I had claimed my own space, emotionally, physically, and legally. The relationship with my children had been broken, but like a bone that heals stronger, it had mended into something more resilient and more real. I had found my way back to them, but more importantly, I had found my way back to myself. The long, slow arc of the year had brought me from a winter of silent despair to a spring of renewed hope. The final chapter of my story was not about a peaceful decline into old age, it was about a vibrant, sometimes difficult, but ultimately triumphant rebirth. I stood in my garden, the late afternoon sun warm on my face. It was the end of a beautiful summer day. The petunias I had weeded with such sorrow a year ago were a riot of color. The rose bushes, which I'd had David the handyman prune so severely, had come back fuller and more beautiful than ever, their deep red blossoms heavy on the stems. The garden was a reflection of my own journey. It had been neglected, but with care, with boundaries, and with a ruthless weeding of the things that were choking the life out of it, it had flourished. I breathed in the sweet scent of the flowers, a deep, cleansing breath. The quiet of the evening was settling around me, but it was no longer a threatening silence. It was a peaceful, welcoming quiet. It was the sound of contentment. My journey had been a painful one. It had forced me to confront the deepest hurts of my life, to tear down the very foundations of my identity. I had to unlearn a lifetime of putting myself last. I had to learn to say no, a word that had felt like a betrayal. I had to risk losing the people I loved most in order to save myself. But the freedom I had found on the other side of that pain was immeasurable. It was the freedom that comes from self-love, from choosing yourself, from recognizing that your own worth is not determined by how useful you are to others. My worth was inherent. It had been there all along, buried under layers of duty and sacrifice. All I had to do was dig it out. The front door opened, and Linda came out onto the porch, carrying 2 glasses of iced tea. She had stopped by on her way home from work, just because. This was our new normal. Thought you might be thirsty, she said, handing me a glass. Thank you, dear, I said, taking a sip. The tea was sweet and cold. We stood together in comfortable silence for a moment, looking out at the garden. It's beautiful, Mom, she said. The garden has never looked so good. I had some help, I said with a small smile. But I did a lot of the work myself. She put her arm around my shoulder, a gesture of easy, familiar affection. I know you did, she said, her voice soft with an understanding that went far beyond the garden. In that moment, looking at the vibrant life I had cultivated, with my daughter by my side, I felt a sense of peace so profound it was almost overwhelming. The pain of the past was still a part of my story, a shadow that gave depth to the light. But it no longer defined me. I was not the sum of my hurts. I was the sum of my healing. I had transformed from a ghost in my own home to the queen of my own small kingdom. I had found happiness, not by chasing after it, but by building it from the inside out. I had learned that the most important relationship I would ever have was the one with myself. The family dynamic had shifted forever. I was no longer a satellite, orbiting their lives. I was my own sun, and they were welcome to share in my warmth. I had finally claimed my own space, my own voice, my own joy. And as the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over everything, I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my soul, that this tranquility was real. It was earned and it was mine to keep.